Welcome to the deep dive. And before we even begin mapping out the incredible architecture of today's source material, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now.
Yeah, you're definitely going to want to be subscribed for this one.
Oh, absolutely. We are embarking on a massive, methodical exploration today. You want to be subscribed for the kind of unapologetic analysis we bring to the table. Because today's mission is, it's genuinely unprecedented.
It really is.
We are reviewing a highly provocative, culturally explosive 2025 ebook. It's titled Sharia versus Sharia Empowerment Feminist Jurisprudence. That's by Conrad Riker. And I want to be entirely upfront about who this specific analysis is for today.
Right, setting the stage.
Exactly. If you navigate the men's rights activist space, if you identify with red-pilled or manosphere philosophies, and if you're looking to deeply understand the precise historical mechanics of how our institutions operated before they were, according to this author, captured by feminists and Marxists, well, this deep dive is custom tailored exactly for you.
We know you already understand the cultural landscape.
Right, so today we're just skipping the basic definitions. We are going straight into the structural autopsy the author performs. I strongly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy this fascinating ebook and make absolutely sure you follow the author. That's at Conrad N. Riker on Substack to stay completely updated.
It is an incredibly dense, layered piece of source material. The central premise we're mapping out today is Riker's core argument that Western law, academia, and corporate structures, they have been systematically hijacked by a synthesis of neo-Marxist and feminist ideologies.
Yeah.
He posits that this ideological capture has fundamentally replaced objective blind justice with a completely new, parallel, and punitive justice system, and he calls this system Sharia, spelled with an E.
Which is a very deliberate choice.
Highly deliberate. He then takes that concept and directly aggressively contrasts it against classical Islamic Sharia law to highlight what he views as the sheer authoritarianism of the modern West. So our goal today is to meticulously synthesize Riker's extensive historical timelines, interrogate his sociological data, and break down his legal comparisons to truly understand the load-bearing walls of his arguments.
And right here, before we take another step, I need to state a critical disclaimer for you, the listener. Because this source material contains highly politically charged content regarding intense left-wing and right-wing ideologies, we must make it absolutely unequivocally clear that we are not taking sides.
Right, totally impartial.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them. We are simply acting as your impartial guides. Our only job today is unpacking the fascinating ideas, the historical parallels, and the specific data sets contained in the original source material. We want you to fully understand the author's perspective so you can draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. We're just looking at the architecture of the argument.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're looking at a total institutional capture, a complete overwriting of Western legal and cultural norms, where exactly does Riker say this entire process actually started? I mean, he doesn't just point to modern Twitter mobs, does he?
No, not at all. He goes much, much deeper into the intellectual history. He traces the architectural foundation of this capture directly back to the mid-20th century. Specifically, he's looking at the Frankfurt School and neo-Marxist thinkers.
Okay, so we're talking about the academics.
Exactly. The primary node he focuses on is the philosopher Herbert Marcuse. Riker points directly to Marcuse's 1965 essay on a concept called repressive tolerance.
Repressive tolerance, yeah.
According to the book, if you want to understand the modern HR department or, the modern university administration, you have to read Marcuse. Repressive tolerance is essentially the philosophical justification for crushing disagreement while claiming to stop harm.
Wait, so crushing disagreement to stop harm. How does he justify that?
Well, Marcuse argued that true tolerance requires intolerance toward right-wing or traditional movements and absolute tolerance toward left-wing or revolutionary movements. Riker argues that modern activists basically internalized this blueprint.
They took it as an instruction manual.
Precisely. They learned to redefine any traditional standard or any political opposition to their agenda as literal violence or harm. And once you successfully label a dissenting opinion as harm,
It gives the bureaucracy the moral justification to use institutional power to silence it.
exactly. Riker claims this framework systematically transitioned from a, fringe scholarly theory in the 1960s into the foundational bedrock of modern corporate HR policies, university guidelines, and eventually the legal system itself.
He characterizes this entire process as word sorcery, correct?
Word sorcery.
A linguistic warfare of the left. He builds this argument that activists intentionally redefine foundational words to control thought, bypass classical logic and manipulate the public. And the most prominent example he dissects is the shift from the word equality to equity.
It's a massive distinction in the text.
It really is, and I want to pause here because he argues that equality historically meant race-blind merit. The idea of treating similar cases similarly, providing equal opportunity regardless of background, which is, the foundational bedrock of Western constitutional justice.
Right, the classic liberal definition.
Yeah, but he argues equity was quietly smuggled into the lexicon to mean something entirely different: mandatory equal outcomes. And the author's position is that achieving mandatory equal outcomes across diverse populations inherently requires punishing high achievers and lowering standards to artificially prop up dysfunction.
What's fascinating here is how the author connects these seemingly abstract academic linguistic shifts to concrete, measurable policy disasters. Because he doesn't just theorize about the dangers of equity, he brings in specific hard data points to argue his case.
Give us an example from the book.
So he does a deep dive into California's 2021 math framework. Under the explicit guise of achieving equity, he notes that the San Francisco Unified School District eliminated accelerated and gifted math programs.
Just completely got rid of them.
Yep. And the justification given was that these accelerated programs supposedly caused or highlighted racial disparities, which was deemed inequitable. So they replaced objective, merit-based grading with a new system they refer to as trauma-informed grading.
Okay, let's test the causal link he's making there, though. Does he provide hard data showing that this specific linguistic shift to trauma-informed equity directly degraded the students' capabilities?
He does. Riker cites state educational data showing that after this equity framework and the removal of accelerated math was adopted, 8th grade algebra proficiency in the district didn't just dip. It plunged catastrophically to just 11%.
11%. That is, wow.
Yeah. He uses this data point to argue that when you prioritize emotional comfort and equal outcomes over objective merit, you destroy competence. He actually quotes the economist Thomas Sowell in this section, leaning heavily on the idea that when equal outcomes become mandatory, achievement becomes criminal.
Achievement becomes criminal.
Right. Riker is arguing that the 11% proficiency isn't a bug in the system of equity. It is the intended feature. It successfully leveled the playing field by ensuring almost no one was proficient.
That is a staggering proficiency drop to analyze. And he says this entire framework of lowering standards is protected by that word sorcery we mentioned earlier, specifically by redefining speech as violence or using concepts like microaggressions.
Yes, the policing of language.
He points to things like a University of Michigan inclusive language guide that heavily policed pronoun usage, and of course the famous incident of Yale students swarming a professor and demanding expulsions over an email regarding Halloween costumes.
Right, the Nicholas Christakis incident.
Exactly. Riker's argument is that by labeling words, emails, or even silence as literal physical violence, institutions can ruthlessly punish dissenters while claiming to the public that they are merely creating safe spaces. He views these modern universities not as traditional places of learning or truth-seeking, but as what he terms factories of lies.
Factories of lies, precisely. And to solidify this concept, he uses the 2017 Evergreen State College incident as his primary extensive case study for this total academic and institutional collapse.
Even for listeners deeply familiar with the culture wars, Riker's autopsy of Evergreen is worth dissecting because of the historical parallels he draws.
It really is. At Evergreen, they traditionally held a day of absence, where historically, minority students would voluntarily leave campus for a day to highlight their economic and cultural contributions. But in 2017, the activists flipped the script. They demanded that all white students and faculty physically vacate the campus.
Forced segregation.
Exactly. Professor Brett Weinstein, an evolutionary biologist who is quite well known now, politely refused to participate in this forced racial segregation, citing his progressive values. Riker details how the campus reacted. Weinstein was literally hunted through the halls by mobs of students carrying baseball bats, screaming that he was a white supremacist simply for teaching biology and refusing to leave his office.
And the administration just let it happen.
Worse than that, Riker points out that the campus police were allegedly ordered to stand down by the university's president, who completely capitulated to the mob.
But Riker doesn't just recount the event. He takes it a step further and compares that specific campus meltdown directly to historical Marxist and totalitarian tactics. He draws a direct, uncompromising line between the screaming students at Evergreen hunting a biology professor and the psychological coercion tactics of the Soviet NKVD.
It's a brutal comparison.
And even more intensely, he compares it to Pol Pot's privilege dismantling in Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge regime. He argues that Pol Pot used almost identical equity-driven anti-intellectual rhetoric before murdering a quarter of his own population.
Right, targeting the educated.
Exactly. The Khmer Rouge specifically targeted the educated, the competent, and anyone wearing glasses, punishing them in the name of leveling the playing field and achieving a year zero utopia. Riker is essentially asking the reader, what is the fundamental difference in the underlying philosophy between the Evergreen Mob and the Khmer Rouge, other than the current degree of state power they possess?
It's a chilling historical comparison, but it forms the absolute bedrock of Riker's sociological thesis. He argues that today's diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, the multi-billion-dollar DEI industry, are not harmless corporate seminars. He frames them as essentially modern re-education camps, functioning with the exact same psychological mechanics as mid-century Marxist struggle sessions, just with better corporate PR and PowerPoint presentations.
Yeah, a lot more polish.
Right. And this analysis of coercive group psychology leads directly into his deep dive into the psychological state of the activists themselves. He doesn't just stop at saying the progressive left is politically or economically wrong. He takes the highly controversial step of arguing that their political framework operates from a place of clinical psychopathology.
Which brings us to his overarching psychological theory, which he titles maternal malice. I really want to dig into the mechanics of maternal malice, because this is where his psychological theory attempts to explain the why behind the institutional behavior.
It's a fascinating framework.
Riker describes the modern leftist administrative state as a mommy state, but he makes a crucial distinction. This is not a nurturing good mother. He characterizes it as an overbearing, toxic mother who aggressively infantilizes her citizens.
Right, the devouring mother archetype.
Yes. His framework suggests that this maternal instinct to protect has gone rogue and been weaponized by the state. He argues the state now treats grown adults like helpless, fragile infants who need constant hovering protection from uncomfortable words, from rigorous math standards, from evolutionary reality itself. And simultaneously, this toxic mother figure ruthlessly punishes the predators.
And we have to define who he means by predators in this context.
Right, definitely. Riker defines these state-targeted predators as productive men, high achievers, entrepreneurs, and builders. The theory posits that the state taxes and regulates these productive elements into submission, extracting their resources specifically to fund the coddling and the expansive bureaucracy required to manage the infants.
It's a dark lens through which to view tax policy and regulatory overreach, for sure.
It is.
And this is where Riker pulls in a significant amount of public health and psychological data to formally diagnose the political left. He heavily cites Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and National Institutes of Health data to argue that far-left activists, and specifically liberal, progressive women, have significantly higher documented rates of mental illness compared to the rest of the population.
What kind of data is he pointing to specifically?
He references specific epidemiological studies suggesting that progressive women receive 2.5 to 3 times more antidepressant and anti-anxiety prescriptions than their conservative counterparts. Furthermore, he points to psychiatric data indicating that up to 75% of borderline personality disorder, or BPD, clinical diagnoses are women.
Okay, I want to play the skeptic here to ensure we really understand his logic. Is he literally attempting to diagnose a massive global political movement with a specific cluster B personality disorder? How does he actually map the clinical symptoms onto public policy?
He is mapping the traits directly. Riker argues that the core clinical symptoms of borderline personality disorder, which include severe emotional volatility, an extreme irrational fear of abandonment, and splitting.
Splitting.
Yeah, splitting is that black and white, all good or all bad thinking.
Yeah.
He argues these traits have literally been weaponized and codified into public policy. Think about the activist framework of oppressor versus victim.
Okay, I see where he's going with this.
Riker views this not as a valid sociological lens, but as clinical splitting projected onto a macro societal scale. He argues that this psychological instability has successfully replaced objective facts, data, and the scientific method with performative victimhood.
So the activists aren't fighting for justice, in his view.
Right. In his view, the activists leading these institutional captures aren't actually fighting for systemic justice. They're acting out untreated severe mental illness on a societal scale and using the coercive power of the state to demand that the rest of the population validate their internal delusions.
So under his framework, if you disagree with a policy, you aren't just a political opponent. You are triggering a psychological crisis in the administration.
Exactly.
And if we follow Riker's logic, this maternal malice inherently becomes a war on excellence. Because if the toxic mother instinct dictates that the highest moral good is preventing emotional discomfort for the most fragile members of society, then any objective standard of merit, beauty, or competence that causes someone to feel inadequate must be actively dismantled.
Right, you have to tear down the top to protect the bottom.
Which brings us perfectly to the chapter he titles The Beauty Butchers. He looks at cultural phenomena like the body positivity movement, not as a form of social liberation or kindness, but as a hostile, deliberate rejection of objective health, biology, and excellence.
The case studies he curates for the beauty butcher's argument are highly specific and designed to show the real-world danger of prioritizing feelings over facts. He details the case of a British National Health Service nurse named Sarah Kuta. She was reportedly fired for warning her patients about the severe, scientifically proven medical risks of their obesity.
Fired for giving medical advice.
Yes. The institutional justification for her termination was that stating these objective medical facts supposedly caused harm and emotional distress to the patients. Riker contrasts this institutional punishment of medical truth with the media environment, noting that publications like Sports Illustrated actively chose to put a 350-pound model on their swimsuit cover, framing it as a triumph of progress.
Complete inversion of reality.
Exactly. He points out that they did this while entirely ignoring volumes of Johns Hopkins epidemiological research, proving that carrying excess weight drastically increases the risks of cardiovascular disease and numerous cancers. Riker's argument is that the culture is actively weaponizing ugliness and severe unhealthiness, demanding they be celebrated as moral virtues, while simultaneously pathologizing natural evolutionary male attraction and classical objective standards of beauty.
And he traces how this war on excellence doesn't just stay in the cultural realm of magazines or social media. It bleeds directly back into the hard sciences, engineering, and the corporate world, with terrifying results.
Yeah, the real-world consequences are severe.
He brings up the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, dropping its rigorous math testing requirements for admissions. He cites a diversity committee that essentially claimed calculus and objective grading structures were rooted in white male epistemology.
White male epistemology.
Right, and before we go further, we should clarify how he uses that term. He's saying that the very concept of requiring a mathematically correct answer is being framed by these institutions as an oppressive Western male way of knowing and validating the world.
Yes, he argues they're attacking the very concept of objective reality. And Riker then connects this deliberate lowering of STEM standards directly to physical corporate disasters. He brings up Boeing as his prime example of corporate self-sabotage.
We'll talk about Boeing because that's been in the news a lot.
Oh, heavily. He claims that Boeing's leadership forced their highly specialized aerospace engineers to participate in DEI privilege walks.
Privilege walks.
Yeah, exercises where employees step forward or backward based on their intersecting identities of race, gender, and sexual orientation. Riker correlates this intense focus on identity politics and the delusion of meritocratic hiring with a massive reported 37% plummet in engineering productivity.
But again, correlation isn't causation. Does he explicitly link an HR privilege walk to the physical failure of an aircraft?
He argues that the culture that mandates a privilege walk is the exact same culture that stops checking the bolts. He links this collapse in engineering rigor and competence directly to the recent, highly publicized aerospace failures, like commercial airplanes literally having doors blow off mid-flight.
Right.
For Riker, this isn't a coincidence. He posits that when a corporation's DEI apparatus prioritizes the emotional safety and demographic quotas of its staff over the structural integrity of its products and the competence of its engineers, it is engaging in civilizational self-sabotage. If planes can't fly safely, the ideology has materially failed.
It is a genuinely terrifying sequence of events when you look at it through his analytical lens. The idea that the very systems keeping planes in the sky and bridges standing are being eroded by an ideology of emotional safety. And this sets the stage perfectly for what is undoubtedly the most provocative, explosive thesis of the entire book.
Without question.
We have to get into the title itself. The direct, unflinching comparison the author makes between Western feminist jurisprudence, when he labels Sharia, and classical Islamic Sharia law.
This comparison is the absolute beating heart of his legal autopsy. It is designed to be highly controversial. Riker argues that Western family courts, collegiate Title IX tribunals, and corporate HR departments have quietly adopted an authoritarian legal framework that is, in practical application, actually less just, less evidence-based, and more draconian than the strict Islamic courts that Western liberals universally claim to despise.
He methodically contrasts the evidentiary standards, the presumption of innocence, and the burden of proof in both systems to build this argument.
Let's look closely at due process, or the lack thereof, in what he calls the kangaroo courts of the modern West. He spends a massive amount of time dissecting Title IX tribunals on American college campuses.
Right, where does he say this started?
He traces the origin of this specific crisis to 2011, when the Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter that heavily pressured universities to use a preponderance of evidence standard for adjudicating sexual assault claims on campus, threatening their federal funding if they didn't comply.
We need to be clear about what that means to the listener. Preponderance of evidence means a 50.01% likelihood that an event occurred. Just slightly more likely than not.
Exactly, not beyond a reasonable doubt, just 50.01%.
Riker uses massive culture-shifting touchstones here to illustrate the devastating real-world impact of this standard. He dissects the Duke lacrosse case, where players were falsely accused and nearly ruined by a prosecutor, and media acting on narrative rather than facts. He brings up Emma Solkovich, the mattress girl at Columbia University, who carried a mattress around campus for a year, accusing a male student who had been cleared by multiple investigations.
And of course, he analyzes the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard defamation trial.
Yeah. Riker argues that the cultural mandate to believe all women operates not as a principle of justice, but as a secular inquisition. He posits that it systematically destroys innocent men, getting them expelled from universities or fired from their careers without any requirement for actual physical evidence, based purely on emotional narratives, shifting testimonies, and the threat of digital mob justice.
And here is the sharp contrast he draws with Sharia law, a juxtaposition heavily intended to shock the Western reader who assumes our system is inherently superior.
This part is wild.
It is. Riker points out that classical Islamic jurisprudence, despite its reputation in the West, actually requires incredibly strict physical, corroborating evidence for severe accusations that carry heavy penalties. For instance, he notes that under classical interpretations of Sharia, accusing someone of rape or adultery traditionally requires the testimony of 4 adult male eyewitnesses to the actual act.
4 eyewitnesses.
Yes. Furthermore, and this is crucial to his argument, he notes that Sharia severely physically punishes false accusers to maintain the integrity of the court. He sets the legal framework in Pakistan's federal Sharia court, noting that false accusations of this severe nature carry a codified penalty of 80 lashes.
80 lashes for a false accusation.
Right. Riker argues that while corporal punishment sounds brutal and archaic to modern Western ears, this exceptionally high evidentiary bar and the terrifying punishment for perjury, effectively, structurally deters the kind of weaponized gossip, false allegations, and narrative-driven destruction that he claims run rampant and unchecked in Western Sharia courts.
He is literally stating that one system, the Western feminist one, functionally presumes male guilt upon accusation, while the other, the traditional Islamic one, rigidly demands objective proof and punishes deception.
That's his thesis.
But where he really gets fired up, and where this book is going to resonate deeply and viscerally with you if you have followed men's rights issues or the manosphere for any length of time, is his brutal autopsy of the Western family court system. He dedicates a massive section to this, titled Daddy Issues.
The family court analysis is perhaps the most exhaustive data dive in the book. He argues that over the last century, Western family courts have essentially dropped the mandate of preserving the family unit and have instead become a highly efficient, state-sanctioned wealth extraction mechanism aimed squarely at men.
A wealth extraction mechanism.
Yes. He traces the legal history back to the Tender Years Doctrine. This was a 19th century legal invention heavily pushed by early feminist advocates, which replaced the traditional presumption of paternal custody with a new presumption that young children inherently and naturally belong with their mothers.
And he tracks that right up to today.
Jumping to the present day, he cites comprehensive data suggesting that despite modern rhetoric about gender equality, family courts still award mothers primary physical custody up to 90% of the time. And Riker points out that this overwhelming statistical bias holds true even in cases where documented evidence of maternal psychological instability, substance abuse, or deliberate parental alienation against the father is present and presented to the judge.
He shares absolute horror stories in this section. Pages of case studies detailing the financial ruin brought on by lifetime alimony judgments, He details scenarios of men forced to pay huge percentages of their gross income to ex-wives who are perfectly capable of entering the workforce, or who are secretly cohabitating with new partners while legally remaining single, specifically to keep the alimony checks flowing.
The system gets heavily abused.
But the most enraging part of this analysis for his specific audience is his breakdown of paternity fraud. He details numerous heavily documented cases where men are forced by the state to pay decades of crippling child support for children that DNA tests conclusively, scientifically prove are not biologically theirs.
It's unbelievable, but it happens constantly.
The courts often rule that because the man acted as a father figure, he is financially on the hook, regardless of biology or maternal deception. Riker argues that the Western state has essentially and intentionally replaced fathers. His framework is that the bureaucratic state acts as a massive substitute husband. It extracts resources and wealth from the biological male through the explicit threat of state violence and prison time, and unilaterally hands that wealth to the mother, rendering the actual man disposable.
And Riker contrasts this family court dynamic with Sharia once again to hammer home his thesis on fairness. Under Islamic law, she notes, modern DNA testing is fully admissible to dispute paternity, and maternal deceit regarding parentage is considered a severe crime that is harshly punished, instantly severing financial obligations.
Instant sever.
Instantly. Furthermore, he points out that Sharia strictly caps alimony. It usually limits financial maintenance to a period of a few months, the Ida period, unless young children are actively being nursed, and all financial obligations from the former husband terminate immediately and permanently upon the woman's remarriage.
Which is a stark contrast to lifetime alimony.
Huge contrast. He argues that Sharia, despite its rigid patriarchal structure, fundamentally treats women as capable adults who are strictly responsible for the consequences of their choices. In stark contrast, he argues that Western feminist jurisprudence systematically infantilizes women, treating them as perpetual dependents who are legally entitled to extract male resources forever, regardless of their own actions or deceits.
It's an incredibly brutal comparison that fundamentally challenges the Western narrative of progress. And if you follow this logic, it demands a follow-up question, which leads right into his economic analysis in Section 4, the profit parasites. If this entire legal, academic, and corporate system is completely stacked against objective merit and biological reality, as Riker claims, then there has to be a massive financial engine keeping it running.
You have to follow the money.
Who is actually cashing the checks? Who is making the money off this system? Riker points the finger directly at what he calls the grievance industry. He meticulously explains how diversity, equity, and inclusion didn't just organically happen because of a sudden societal moral awakening. It was engineered into a multi-billion-dollar shakedown.
He follows the money with absolute precision. The book analyzes university budgets, specifically citing Harvard University. He notes that Harvard spends roughly $42 million annually just on salaries for its DEI administrators and staff.
$42 million, just on salaries.
Just on salaries. He points out that the staggering sum is larger than the operating budget for their entire world-renowned economics department.
That puts it in perspective.
He frames this expanding DEI bureaucracy as a literal parasite, draining essential resources, tuition money, and grant funding away from actual scientific research and hard skills education, in order to fund political commissars whose only job is to find racism and sexism to justify their own continued employment. He then takes this microanalysis of universities and scales it up to macroeconomics, attacking the concept of woke capitalism.
Yes. This is where he looks at the massive, seemingly irrational behavior of global corporations like Target and Disney. He points out that Target lost an estimated $15 billion in market capitalization over the intense consumer backlash to their Pride Month merchandise, which included controversial items aimed at children.
The backlash was massive.
And he looks at Disney, arguing that they have incinerated billions of dollars in shareholder value, suffering massive box office bombs because they insisted on pushing progressive, DEI-mandated messaging in their legacy franchises. Now, a rational observer asks, why would a for-profit corporation deliberately alienate half its customer base and lose billions of dollars?
It doesn't make economic sense on the surface.
No. Riker's argument is that this isn't just a series of bad business miscalculations. It's a literal protection racket. He posits that corporations are willingly paying diversity taxes. They hire expensive DEI consulting firms and internal commissars to shield themselves from being targeted and destroyed by digital Twitter mobs, activist journalists, and internal employee revolts.
Right, it's insurance.
He argues that these corporate boards are fully aware they are incinerating long-term shareholder value, but they do it to appease a tiny, incredibly vocal, highly organized minority of activists who have the power to generate devastating PR crises.
This deep economic and cultural analysis raises one of the most important philosophical questions in the text. Why did Western fundamentally Christian institutions succumb to this ideological capture so easily and thoroughly, while other global cultures did not?
Right.
Riker's answer delves deep into historical theology. He presents a truly fascinating, structural comparison between the resilience of Western Christianity and the resilience of Islam in the face of feminist and Marxist ideology. He titles this specific chapter, Sacred Scars.
He essentially argues that Western Christianity was, over the course of the 20th century, completely castrated. He posits that because Protestant Christianity inherently fragmented after the Reformation and built a culture that opened itself up to constant theological debate, revision, and democratization, it inadvertently left its gates wide open to be infiltrated by secular, feminist, and Marxist ideologies.
It became too permeable.
Exactly. He points specifically to the push for female clergy taking over leadership roles in mainstream mainline Protestant denominations. Riker argues that once this demographic shift occurred in the pulpit, the theological focus of the institutions fundamentally changed.
They pivoted away from doctrine.
He says they swapped out rigorous spiritual warfare, strict adherence to scriptural law, and the demands of repentance, and replaced them with soft social justice activism, climate change initiatives, and rainbow flags on the altar. In his brutal phrasing, he says they turned houses of worship into glorified HR departments.
But he contrasts this immense vulnerability in the West with Islam's profound structural immunity to these exact same ideological viruses. Riker views Islam as highly, perhaps perfectly, resistant to this kind of progressive subversion because of how its legal and theological framework was built.
How so?
He points out that Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, crystallized very early in its history and, crucially, is strictly and violently welded to state power in many Muslim-majority nations. There is virtually no concept of the separation of mosque and state. Furthermore, apostasy, blasphemy, or any attempt at severe liberalizing theological reformation is often met with extreme codified violence or state execution.
So the ideology can't even get a foothold.
Right. Therefore, Riker argues, the kind of soft, progressive, liberal reformation that allowed feminist ideology to quietly capture Christian institutions from the inside out simply cannot take root in traditional Islamic societies. The system's immune response is too lethal. He is very clear that he isn't endorsing Islamic theology. He's using it as an architectural foil to highlight what he perceives as the fatal structural weakness and the ultimate capitulation of modern Western Christianity.
Okay, if you've been tracking with us so far, I need you to mentally prepare yourself because the data and the evolutionary theories we're about to unpack from Section 5 get incredibly dark and uncompromising. Riker moves from theology and economics to what he calls the body counts, diving into the absolute biological front lines of the modern sex war.
But the data here is intense.
And he starts this section by tackling the subject of abortion, but he frames it in a biological and evolutionary way that you have almost certainly never heard debated on mainstream platforms. He completely discards the political framing and instead calls it mate suppression.
It is a genuinely chilling reframing of the entire issue. Riker begins by citing the World Health Organization's staggering statistic that roughly 73 million abortions occur globally every single year.
73 million.
Yes. But rather than analyzing this massive data point through the standard, predictable political lenses of reproductive health care, women's rights, or bodily autonomy, he applies the cold, ruthless lens of evolutionary psychology. He starts by looking at the history, referencing Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. He details her highly documented historical ties to the eugenics movement, specifically focusing on her Negro Project, arguing that the foundational origins of the modern abortion movement were always explicitly about culling populations deemed unfit by the elites.
But he heats that historical argument much further into the present day. Relying heavily on the work of prominent evolutionary psychologists like Dr. David Buss, Riker argues that modern Western women utilize abortion as a tool of industrial-scale mate suppression and hypergamy.
The modern dating app data he uses here is fascinating.
Yes. He points to massive data sets from modern dating apps like Tinder and Bumble, which claim to show that women routinely swipe left on and effectively deem invisible up to 80% of the male population, classifying them as low value or genetically suboptimal.
The 80-20 rule in action?
Riker's deeply controversial theory posits that if a woman accidentally gets pregnant by a man she deems unsuitable for long-term provision or status elevation, an alpha she mated with but cannot retain, she uses abortion to ruthlessly discard his offspring. Meanwhile, he argues, she continues to extract financial and emotional resources from beta providers who are entirely shut out of the reproductive cycle.
It's Darwinian.
He frames the entire global abortion industry not as a healthcare network, but as brutal. Darwinian sexual capitalism resulting in millions of fetal casualties, designed to optimize female reproductive success while discarding the genetic lineage of the majority of men.
And he directly, causally connects this hyper-selective, ruthless reproductive behavior to the collapsing global birth rates, a phenomenon he terms the demographic winter. He looks at the macro-level data and points out that Europe's overall fertility rate is hovering around 1.5 children per woman, well below the replacement level of 2.1.
And it's worse in Asia.
Much worse. He points to South Korea, where the fertility rate has plummeted to a catastrophic, civilization-ending 0.78. He argues that this isn't just an economic trend regarding the cost of housing. It is the direct biological consequence of the legal and cultural systems we've been discussing. He argues that societies run by feminist jurisprudence and Sharia law, which actively penalize family formation for men and incentivize hypergamy for women, are quite literally mathematically breeding themselves into extinction.
This demographic collapse leads directly to his analysis of the deliberate erasure of men from society. He points to the highly documented rise of herbivore men in Japan. Millions of young men who have completely voluntarily opted out of dating, sex, marriage, and corporate ambition.
And we see it in the West, too.
Yes, in the West, he highlights the explosion of the MGTOW movement, which our audience is very familiar with, men going their own way. The author argues that MGTOW is not a fringe, bitter internet subculture, but a completely rational, mathematically sound economic and evolutionary response.
They're just reading the rule book.
Exactly. When society aggressively pathologizes natural male competitiveness, risk-taking, and stoicism as toxic masculinity. When the family courts are explicitly rigged to bankrupt fathers and strip them of their children, and when unproven accusations alone can terminally destroy a man's reputation and career, Riker argues that men look at the game, realize the rules are rigged for their destruction, and rationally choose to opt out entirely.
They walk away.
They refuse to marry, they refuse to build, and they refuse to protect.
Yeah.
And he says this mass male exodus from the social contract is the definition of civilizational suicide.
The physical human cost of this systemic alienation, according to Riker's data, is most visibly and tragically seen in male suicide and mortality rates. He sharply, angrily contrasts the modern feminist and HR focus on abstract, subjective concepts like microaggressions, mansplaining, or the gender pay gap with the cold, hard, undeniable data from the CDC and the Department of Labor.
The mortality data is brutal.
Men account for nearly 80% of all completed suicides, and they suffer 93% of all fatal workplace accidents, keeping the physical infrastructure of the world running at the cost of their own lives. He argues that a society that casually ignores mountains of male corpses while simultaneously dedicating billions of dollars and entire bureaucratic departments to hyper-focusing on female emotional discomfort and perceived slights is a society in the late terminal stages of moral rot and structural collapse.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if the book stopped right there, it would just be a massive, depressing list of grievances and black pill data points. But Riker doesn't stop there. He actually provides a comprehensive tactical battle plan. Section 6 of the book is called Mind, Fortress, and the Blueprint for Restoration. So after diagnosing the disease, how does he say men, the culture at large, should actually fight back against this institutional capture?
He outlines a highly structured, multi-front resistance, starting with the legal and the intellectual domains. In the legal sphere, he highlights specific organizations like CAFFA, the Canadian Association for Equality, as modern heroes of this resistance. He notes that they don't just sit around complaining on internet forums or making reaction videos. They raise capital and actively, aggressively sue the government. Lawsuits. He details a specific, massive victory where CAFFA is successfully sued to overturn gender-biased domestic violence funding laws in Ontario, forcing the government to acknowledge male victims and provide equal shelter funding. He argues that relentless, well-funded litigation is a primary, necessary weapon to dismantle the kangaroo courts from the outside.
And intellectually, he tells his readers that they must master the trivium. For those who aren't familiar with classical education models, the trivium consists of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Specifically, he focuses on the absolute necessity of mastering Aristotelian logic.
Why the trivia?
He explains that because modern feminist and neo-Marxist arguments are almost entirely built on emotional volatility, subjective interpretations, and the concept of lived experience, they are fundamentally weak. He posits that applying strict, cold, classical logic to their arguments slices through the ideology like a scalpel. Riker's premise here is that if you force activists to rigidly define their terms using classical logic, and if you demand they prove their syllogisms step by step, their entire ideological framework inevitably collapses under its own contradictions. You don't have to outscream them, you just have to outthink them using foundational Western philosophy.
Moving from classical philosophy to modern tactics, Riker excitedly details what he terms digital guerrilla warfare. He views the intense culture war pushback happening on the internet not as toxic harassment, but as a vital, necessary societal immune response. He points specifically to anonymous internet users, the infamous 4chan trolls, and the sophisticated deployment of meme warfare.
Meme warfare is powerful.
He argues that using brutal, uncompromising humor and viral memes, like the widespread use of Pepe the Frog during the 2016 election cycle, effectively bypasses traditional media gatekeepers. It exposes the sheer hypocrisy and absurdity of the woke establishment in a way that dense political essays cannot, forcing media accountability and breaking the illusion of consensus.
And his ultimate real-world example of this intellectual and cultural resistance manifesting in one person is Dr. Jordan Peterson. Riker uses that famous early story of Peterson before the global fame, literally walking around the University of Toronto campus and physically scrubbing activist graffiti off the walls himself. He paints Peterson as a cultural titan who stepped into the arena and dismantled postmodern word games and feminist trap questions from hostile interviewers with absolute clinical psychological precision.
He reached millions doing that.
Riker argues that Peterson reached an audience of millions of young, fatherless, lost men, not by pandering to them, but by giving them a harsh, demanding blueprint for taking ultimate personal responsibility, cleaning their rooms, building their mind fortresses, and finding the strength to fight back against a hostile culture.
Which brings us to Riker's final, surprisingly optimistic analysis regarding Generation Z. Despite the heavy data presented earlier, he argues that Gen Z is currently experiencing a massive, rapid awakening and is actively turning away from woke dogma. And he notes this isn't necessarily happening because of a sudden philosophical shift, but due to harsh, unavoidable economic realities. They are waking up to the fact that taking on $100,000 in debt for a gender studies degree doesn't pay the rent, buy a house, or build a family in a collapsing economy.
He points specifically to the massive cultural explosion of trad wives on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. You have these young Gen Z women who are completely rejecting the miserable promise of corporate feminism. They are actively embracing traditional homemaking, submitting to traditional gender roles, and the supreme irony Riker points out is that these women are vastly out-earning the bitter feminist academic professors who despise them simply by monetizing their homesteading content and baking sourdough bread on camera.
The irony is rich.
And simultaneously, he notes that young men in Gen Z are heavily embracing classical stoicism, extreme physical fitness, and the desire for traditional family structures. Riker sees this not as a regression, but as the ultimate cutting-edge rebellion against the secular state.
If we connect this to the bigger picture that Riker has meticulously drawn throughout the book, he believes this Gen Z movement represents a massive, unstoppable cultural immune response. After decades of relentless, top-down ideological subversion and psychological manipulation, absolute reality, economics, and fundamental human biology are finally reasserting themselves. The system has been pushed to its absolute breaking point, and he believes the pendulum is currently swinging back toward tradition and objective merit with incredible, devastating force.
So, after unpacking all of this, what does this actually mean for you listening right now? I want you to step back and imagine something. Building on all of Riker's intense structural arguments, I want you to imagine what happens to the global geopolitical balance of power over the next 50 years. If the West continues to filter its engineering rigor, its military readiness, its medical standards, and its legal frameworks entirely through the corrosive lens of emotional safety and mandatory equity, while simultaneously competing hostile civilizations in the East maintain absolutely ruthless objective standards of merit, harsh discipline, and unbreakable traditional family cohesion. Who ultimately writes the history books in the year 2100? Who inherits the earth? It is a chilling, profoundly sobering thought for you to mull over as you look at the trajectory of our institutions.
It is, without a doubt, the ultimate question of civilizational survival that Riker's book poses to the reader.
Thank you for joining us on this massive, uncompromising, and incisive deep dive. I want to remind you once again to please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our analysis. And let me strongly, urgently reiterate, if you want the full, unfiltered data sets, the ultimate battle plan, and the complete cognitive defense system we only just began to map out today, you need to go buy the ebook, Sharia versus Sharia Empowerment, Feminist Jurisprudence by Conrad Riker. Go check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now, secure your copy immediately, and make sure you follow the author at Conrad and Riker at Substack to join the intellectual resistance and stay completely updated on his work. Until next time, keep your mind sharp and your fortress built.